Welcome to this episode of Japan's Top Business Interviews. I'm your host, Dr. Greg Story, the president of Dale Carnegie Training Japan, and it's my great pleasure to introduce Bob Noddin, who is the CEO of AIG Japan. Bob, welcome to the show.
Good to be here, Greg.
Well, tell us about how you got to Japan and got to be running AIG in Japan. How did all that happen?
Well, it's a good question. I first started out here in 1982 as a college exchange student. Down in Osaka, left here after 6 months with the full Monty, homestay program, etc. Convinced that I wasn't exactly sure what I wanted to do, but I knew what I didn't want to do.
So why did you come to Japan on a college exchange student? You could have probably gone to Italy or Sweden or something, I'm sure. Why did you choose, or how was it that you were able to get that college exchange program to come here?
Well, it's a good question. I had studied a lot of languages before that. Before the Japan trip, I had studied German in university, and I was getting ready to actually go to Vienna, Austria. I had applied, gotten accepted, was ready to do it. Went to see my advisor at school to get his approval to sign off on everything. He happened to be Japanese, and he said, "Why are you going to Europe?" This is 1982, and said the future's in Asia and not Europe. And so he convinced me in the space of about a half hour's conversation. We had a problem because nobody had ever been here before, so I had to go every evening at 10 o'clock at night. He'd call the school in Osaka. We'd pick a program. I'd get the details. The next day I would go get the department head approvals to sanction the curriculum so that I could get credit for it. After 5 days, we got on the phone on a Friday night. They said he's accepted. Saturday, I called my parents, who at this point in time thought I was going to Vienna, and said, it's all set. And they said, great, we're already looking at the fall to figure out when we should be coming over. We're looking forward to see Europe. And I said, it's not Europe, it's Japan. That brought about a bit of a shock. But yeah, that's how it started. So.
Wow, how about that? And which university were you attached to in Osaka?
I was Kansai Gaidai, Kansai University of Foreign Studies down there. I still actually have connected with them. I've helped them with internship programs. I have a scholarship program to support kids working down there in the summertime because they don't have a stipend to support it. Guest lecture down there as well. And they gave me an honorary degree about a year and a half ago, too. So, yeah.
Congratulations.
I got this funky-looking thing all in Japanese framed hanging in my office. So.
Yeah, congratulations. And so you come up to Japan, it's a full Monty, total immersion, and then you go back home, and then the Japan bug got you and it brought you back here?
Yeah, I wouldn't say it was the Japan bug, it was the international bug. So when I got out of school, I joined Citibank, because I didn't know what I wanted to do, but I knew I didn't want to sit behind a desk and do the same thing day in and day out. And I had been advised, well, if you don't know what you want to do and you want to go into international business, go into banking. And I did, and it was a magnificent experience. And literally after a little more than 2 years, I was ready to transfer to Japan with Citibank. They'd offered me a role here. So I had a receiving group in Japan and a sending group in the States. Sending group in the States decided about a month before I was due to leave that they didn't like that idea. They pulled the offer off, and they said, you're not going anywhere, we need you. So I called.
You're obviously doing too good a job.
Well, I'm not sure, whatever, but I picked up the phone, called my ex-boss who had left AIG to go to Citi, had left Citi to go to AIG and was Chief Information Officer. So I called him. We had a conversation on Friday. I started with them on Monday.
Wow.
And that was 34 and a half years ago.
With AIG at that time,
yeah,
so quickly.
Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah, I'm a Boston boy. I was in New York. I grew up, you're supposed to hate New York if you're from Boston, et cetera. So I had all these, nightmares of New York franchises winning World Series and Super Bowls and all the rest of that stuff. So if I wasn't going to be doing what I wanted to do, I didn't want to be in New York. So I switched with the hope and the promise that AIG would give me that chance because I had some Japanese language and culture behind me, and a couple of years later it came to fruition.
So they were more open to having you in Japan?
Yeah, they were a lot more open. So I came over on a short-term assignment. It was 6 months. When I finished, we were having some trauma that was unfolding in the Philippines. I had gone down there. The emperor had passed away here, and the country had gone into shutdown mourning mode. So I couldn't work here, so I went down to the Philippines for a couple of weeks, a week and a half to work down there. Ended up getting involved in a few things there, and when I wrapped up here, they then said, would you come down to the Phils? So we were merging 3 companies, and it was a bit of a mess, and they'd said, you figure it out. So went down there. That 4-month assignment became 4 years, then Thailand for 4 years, then back to Manila for 2.5, then Hong Kong for 4, then here for 4. And along that way, I ended up with a wife and 3 boys and got back to Tokyo 2002.
Sounds like the long route back to Tokyo.
Yeah, it was a little convoluted. It was a very Asian immersion and experience. So I wrapped up in Japan. 2006, they asked me to go to the States, do a global job.
So sorry, you got back to Japan in what year?
2002.
So you're here for 4 years.
I was here for 4 years.
And what were you doing in those 4 years?
So at that point in time, I was responsible for Japan and Korea for all our operations, technology, real estate, administration, procurement, customer service.
Wow,
what we call
just about everything.
Well, it was a big role. Japan's our biggest operation in the world outside of the United States. Korea is about the 5th largest, so overseeing the 2 of those was pretty sizable.
So 4 years here, then back to the States.
2.5 years as the global head of operations and technology for our property casualty business. So insurance has life insurance and property casualty. I was doing that role across both the U.S. and the international operations for property casualty. This was before the crisis in 2008, 2009. I had 26,000 people in AIG that I was responsible for.
Wow.
And then the crisis hit, and we started spinning pieces off. And I put my hand up in March of 2009 and said, I don't want to leave the company, but if you guys don't send me back overseas, I can't recover from the financial beating I've taken in this process. And they said, good, go back to Japan. We never finished what you started.
And what was the position they sent you back to in Japan?
So when I came back, I actually did a lateral move. I came back as the chief operating officer of our biggest subsidiary here, because the gentleman that they had brought in to do that job didn't have an insurance experience. They had originally brought him in expecting he was going to be the chairman, but the CEO got into some trouble locally, and they removed him, and then he stepped into the CEO's role. I came back. He didn't have an insurance background. They said, help him. About 13 months later, we had the Great East Japan earthquake disaster and radiation issues, and they said, why don't you take this business over? So that started in 2011. I took over the biggest subsidiary here, which was the AIU Insurance Company, our initial offering here in Japan that dated back to 1946. And then they said, right, progression over the next 2 years, why don't you take over all of it, and then for good measure, handle Korea as well.
So all of it means how many people in Japan?
Well, it's reduced a little bit because we sold a life insurance company a while back.
At that time.
Yeah, when I walked back, it was about 11,000 people. We had 162 branches across the country, from Naha in the southern tip of Okinawa all the way up to the northern reaches of Hokkaido. It was 4 insurance companies, a joint venture company that we have 50-50 with JTB that focuses on travel insurance and various and sundry other bits and pieces in that process.
So think about the leadership aspect of this. So you've come up, you've been in Asia, and now you went to that 4-year period in Japan where you had a big job, actually, a big job. And that's, I'm guessing, apart from that 6-month period where you did that project, that's really probably your first experience of actually leading teams, being accountable, you're responsible. And you'd actually already been in Asia, so it wasn't just doing the American Japan thing. You'd actually had quite a bit of context about leading in Asia, which is unusual for most North American leaders. And so what were the things when you got to Japan you said, oh, this is a bit different from the Philippines, Thailand, etc.
Right.
This is different from the States. What things sort of stood out for you?
Well, first of all, it was bigger than anything else we were doing. It was more complex because we had multiple businesses in the same market. I think the thing that, what certainly helped me was the fact that I'd done the exchange program, and I had a couple of classes in that program that were really quite helpful. One was Japanese psychology, and one was Japan in the 20th century, right? Both quite helpful in getting me to understand context, society, culture, et cetera. So I wasn't totally surprised by what I saw, But the challenges to overcoming those things that I was reasonably familiar with were really, really difficult. This is a country that likes structure, right? It likes seniority, right? For the longest time coming out of the war and the rebuilding process, it was focused on teamwork and collaboration and incremental improvements, right? And so trying to do anything bold and trying to do anything that relied heavily on innovation and breaking tradition, et cetera, rubbed against friction. There was a lot of friction rubbed against the system quite dramatically. So understanding that those were, sort of cultural components of how people like to operate, like to work in an environment like that. That was the thing that became the biggest sort of, okay, how am I going to get there? What am I going to do? Because the task, when I came back, wasn't, okay, everything's going great. It was, look, this is not working, fix it.
And that's often the issue, isn't it? You have headquarters has a view of Japan, but they don't have the on-the-ground experience of Japan. So when they think, oh, well, just fix it, make a few changes, get it flying straight line, sounds good. But then when you get here and you realize, well, there's a lot of difficulty in getting any sort of change in this country at all, that's when it gets a bit more interesting. So how did you actually deal with headquarters? Because often that's the biggest problem. You've got somebody back in headquarters can't understand why you're not doing your job in Japan and getting things to happen as quickly as they should happen, because that's in the States, that wouldn't have been a problem. How did you deal with that aspect of things?
Well, I will say this. One thing that I will give AIG credit for was that in our international division, the biggest job in the world was Japan. So you didn't come here first. You earned your way into the Japan job, right? And so when I got here, I'd had 20 years, 15 years worth of seasoning, and Asia helped because a Chinese culture, a Japanese culture, a Korean culture, there's plenty of similarities. They're not the same, but there's a lot in common, right? And because the next step up was a global job, there were plenty of people in headquarters that understood Japan was different and hard. However, the idea that you would say to anybody in the head office, look, Japan's different, over time just puts the hair up on the back of their necks. They get pissed off. They say, look, I'm not interested in that. You got a job to do. Get on with it. Don't give me this sob story about Japan's different. So I think the challenge that we recognized was because there's a tradition, our company used to send people in for 3 years. You did a nice job. They rotated you out. So you created a layer of management that was the buffer between the silly gaijin that was coming in here to do all this crazy stuff and everybody who's doing things day to day. And I call it the thermal layer. That layer created this sort of buffer between what Bob, the new CEO, said we were supposed to do versus what everybody else said we were supposed to do. My point to head office was, you're not going to change this place if you think we're going to do 3 years and I'm out. It's consistency, it's sustainability of the vision and the theme that's going to matter. They have to know that when they wake up tomorrow, I'm still here, I'm not going anywhere, and we're going to deal with this.
Now, is that thermal layer an enabler or a detractor?
I would say 95% of the time it's a detractor, and especially in an environment where seniority matters, where structure matters. There's a system here called the Nanko system for the folks that aren't that familiar with it. It's gradually eroding and being replaced, but it's still fundamentally the way most Japanese companies behave.
The Nanko system here means you rise according to your age and stage,
seniority,
and how many years you've been in the company.
Bingo,
it's like an escalator system, not based on productivity, capability, accountability, results, output, none of that.
Right.
Now you're 40, now you're a division head type of thing. Okay.
And if you're 35 and you're smart, shut up, because you're not going to move any faster because you have some great idea, right? And it served the country well coming out of needing to repair itself and rebuild, et cetera. But it was also the thing that was going to stymie it from really innovating and driving forward.
So how do you go about dealing with this thermal layer? Because you can't individually deal with every single person. So you have to have some middle management component there to work through. So and knowing that you'd had a lot of people who'd been in Japan, they had some understanding of Japan, but still you've got the responsibility. They're not taking any sob story from you. They're looking for outcomes. So how do you get that thermal layer to move?
I'm going to tell you the journey I'm on because I would be lying if I told you 10 and a half years in I've succeeded. We're making a heck of a lot of progress. But the challenge was, the first was to sort of identify who was naturally behaving in the way that I needed them to anyways, right? That's not going to be the majority, but who is it? And how do we begin to identify that and give them some rope and some room to run with? And then shift your gears to the remainder and say, okay, of that group, who with some training and some support could become part of that can-do group, and who isn't, right?
Bit of a triage, isn't it?
Absolutely. And then
who's out there, who could be out there, and who's never going to be out there?
Yeah, and then you got to sort of get to the point where who's a detractor and is cancerous versus who's just dead wood, right? And so we started with a program of outlining what we expected the new behaviors were to be. We were in the process of merging a Japanese company we bought with a foreign company we had. And
which in itself is a major undertaking. Forget about satisfying headquarters and their aspirations about Japan. Just sheerly merging those companies together would be a nightmare.
It was a brutal process that I wouldn't wish on my enemies. The quality expectation and standard in Japan is so high that you can't anticipate every single thing that won't go right. And when something does, and you have to go into the regulator and apologize and admit your mistakes, et cetera, and they just stare at you as if you have three heads. It's difficult. I've
met those regulators for banks anyway. I remember how cheery.
Same regulators. A lot better now than they were years past, but it's still a challenge. We had to recognize that first and foremost we were going to articulate what the expected behaviors were. The next piece of it was we then instituted a training program. And I went externally. I talked to the construction industry. I talked to the banking industry. I talked to the manufacturing industry, for cosmetics industry locally. Tell me what you've done, how you've done it. What should I be mindful of? Japanese executives, not foreign executives, but which was really quite helpful. So we then began to identify, here's the behaviors that we expect. And we started to do that in form of role play. We ran special training programs where we introduced role play. My example, which I kept throwing out to everybody, was the Office, the British version of it, not the U.S. version, which was so painfully real, right, that you cried when you laughed at the same time. And I said, look, we got to get people to understand. They got to be self-reflective, and they also have to look around the room and say, oh, that's such and such kind of person, and that's such and such kind of person. So we began a process of introducing that component to this middle management training program. And at this stage in the game, I'm going to pat myself and my team on the back and say about 50% of my middle management is on site.
It's a pretty big deal.
The other 50% isn't.
You're talking culture here. You're talking about not just changing a few people and positions in the organizational chart. You're talking about changing the entire culture, behavior. Thinking of the organization. I mean, to get 50% of people to actually get on board with that in Japan, for me, is outstanding change.
I think as I've traveled around the country, the thing that's been fun has been when I'm out in my call centers or I'm in the admin centers, et cetera, and I go to meet the teams, et cetera, and I say, I give them my little spiel and I say, this is what we're doing and I'm passionate about this and what can I answer for you? And they start asking me questions personally. What do you do on the weekends, and what's your family life like, et cetera? It's because they're searching for something else than the norm, right? And the beauty of what we experienced was that I felt like most people who joined our company, they joined a company called AIG, American International Group. They had some kind of expectation coming in that it wasn't a Japanese company. Sadly, they got in there, and here was this Ninko system. Here's the 40-year-old supervisor who's been taken, almost 20 years to get to that point. And the last thing they want to do is change anything at that stage in the game. So we've made a lot of progress. Do I feel like we're there yet? No. I think the thing that's helped is about 7 years ago, about 3 years in, I realized I didn't like the way we were recruiting the new talent that came in.
What triggered that perception? Because often at your level, you're running the whole operation here, so you've got to delegate certain tasks, and that's a task that normally gets handed off to HR.
Yeah.
And people, you've got lots of people coming in at different stages, and so, okay, they're getting onboarded into the company, and that's sort of happening in the bowels of the company.
Yeah.
But what did you notice? You think to yourself, wait a minute, maybe we've got the wrong makeup here for where we want to go?
So I think my tip would be, you got to occasionally reach down into the organization and go walk the talk. So it was our first year. We went to the Boston Career Forum, a great location for recruiting Japanese-speaking talent, not just Japanese, but Japanese-speaking talent. We went. We had a good booth. We were excited. We had a good crew of young talent in there helping promote people, et cetera. And I went. And so I was there. This bouncy young Japanese gal came walking up to me. She was 20 years old. She was studying in Boston at one of the universities. She'd grown up in Shanghai. Her father was a big shot for one of the Japanese manufacturing companies. But he'd actually put her in the international school, not the Japanese school. So she came in. She started speaking to me. She was eager, excited, and she spoke fluent Mandarin, fluent Japanese, and fluent English. But because she wasn't educated in the Japanese system, when she went into my HR team for the interview, they said, oh, her written kanji's not college level. She would never make it. So they threw her out. I had somebody that spoke fluent English, fluent Mandarin, and fluent Japanese, and we could do a little work to help her grow her kanji. As an example. And they threw her out.
More than one country. And if you were thinking about future talent for a global company, you would be looking for where do we bring those people in, as opposed to the Japanese team is looking for someone who's going to fit in with their little picture, right? Yeah.
I think the key to me was, as a person who'd been an exchange student, who'd studied overseas, who liked languages, I also knew that when you study a language, you learn more than a language. You got to understand culture, you got to understand society, et cetera, in order to really embrace the language. So to me, that was the breakthrough moment for me. I almost fired the HR person at the spot. I bit my tongue, et cetera. But I came back and I pulled the HR director and I said, no more recruiting like this. From now on, if we're recruiting people into any job that has a professional career track, they must speak at least one other language with a degree of fluency. It doesn't have to be English. English is great, but we're a global company. So the fact that you are exposed to another language and another culture will broaden your perspectives. Because I do think one of the challenges that any foreigner experiences when they come to Japan is if you haven't experienced the Japanese education system, you don't understand how people are trained and educated to think. And this is my theory and only my theory, my biggest eye-opener was when I was a college exchange student and I was taking my written Japanese class and I was learning my first kanji characters. And you were sitting in the class and you were working on these characters and the teacher would telling you the stroke sequence. And she'd walk around like she was a Catholic nun in a Catholic school type of stuff, watching you write it, and she'd smack your desk if you, in fact, didn't do it in the right sequence. And I remember saying to her, but it still looks the same. What difference does it make? And she said, it's not right if it's not done in the right sequence. And because the written language is basically pictorial, right? It's a modern hieroglyphic, if you will, right? There's only one way to do it. There's only one right way to do it. That creates a fundamental premise in the workplace. And anybody coming in here needs to appreciate that to get people to be willing to try different things, and don't be afraid it won't work perfectly, or you might not have the right answer. That's a big leap for people because they didn't grow up that way.
And what happens to them in the Japanese system if they do something wrong? The downside of that is massive, and the upside is zero. So people are so risk averse here, they'd rather not end up with an answer that wasn't right or something that didn't work. They won't take the chance. And then when you bring in the people who will take the chance, they get isolated, right, because they become a threat to everybody else in their process. And if they make any misstep, then they get ostracized in the process. So that was another challenge with me in focusing on recruiting a different kind of new breed of new hires. And how do you go around the teams and basically input the idea into their minds that you're a risk management expert organization.
Right.
You know more about managing risk than any other industry. So you've got capabilities, on that side to say, hey, we are experts in managing risk. We are prepared to take risk in certain areas for certain outcomes because we know how to manage it. And we know that in doing something new for the first time, there's a possibility it won't go perfectly. We can't expect a completely new thing to go perfectly. We're okay with that, and we're going to learn from that because we know how to manage risk. So how do you take that concept and get it into people who've been educated? There's only one way of doing the kanji. Make no mistakes, no defects, no errors, and get them to change. How did you get them to start thinking?
Well, I think the first thing I did was make myself approachable, right? You couldn't be the super god sits up in the ivory tower. You needed to be out visibly accessible to them. You needed to actually get your hands dirty on occasion with them. And so as we tried new things and anything, I would be pushing people to go the extra mile or go down the other corner kind of thing. And whenever anything went wrong, I made it a point of stepping up and saying, that's on me. I made that decision. It didn't pan out. So we'll learn from it and move on. We had to actually single out a few instances where somebody had done the right thing but hadn't come up with the right outcome. And that was a little tricky. But
single them out
for the courage to try something
praise.
New, for the willingness. Yeah. So we
Not
basically
for punishment.
absolutely not. People who took the chance and didn't succeed, we didn't call it out as a failure. We talked about the upside. What were the things we learned out of that process? Thanks for having the courage to try that, et cetera. I was about 3 or 4 years in when I did something that was unheralded. I promoted 4 people that were at a certain level and had only been in the company about 15 years, straight up to assistant vice president, I had ex-employees that had retired, and were 70 years old, but had left the company 10 years before coming in and complaining to me that I'd broken tradition and I'd broken ranks. I said, yeah, I absolutely did, because they earned it. They took chances, they succeeded more than they failed, they weren't afraid to give it a shot, and they earned this, right? And, for a little while, it was awkward, but each and every one of them had earned it.
Did you get pushback from clients as well? Because, stepping out of line, not well regarded in this culture. And so it's one thing within your own company, and often the people involved in your own company are worried about what the clients will think, react, say, do. And when you start making these sorts of changes and the clients get wind of it, they may not understand what's going on here. Did you ever get pushback from them, or did you get the clients won't like it approach from your own people?
I think first of all, my business is heavily intermediated. So I have the vast majority of my business is sourced through independent producers, independent agents, insurance agents. So the customer is somebody they brought to my business, not I got on my own, right? And so the real lever there is them. Now, the vast majority of them are people that we recruited, we trained them, and we created their success capability. They wanted something different. They chose to do business with us as opposed to a
Well, they're
Japanese
independent
company.
little small.
They're basically
bands,
small
aren't
business.
they?
Well, the more successful ones are small operations that maybe have 5 other salespeople and a couple of administrative folks, et cetera, kind of thing. But by and large, they're small businesses, right? And they wanted something different.
So from their point of view, this is great.
They expected it, right? And so then it meant I needed to visibly be out with them regularly, because they needed to be able to criticize, they needed to be able to suggest, they needed to be able to point out opportunities and engage them in a process. So when I came back, the reason I came back was we were slowly shrinking, our expenses were growing, we were becoming more and more uncompetitive. Well, it was 2009. The financial crisis was still painfully in everybody's back pocket and sometimes staring them in the face. And I came back and realized that here was my AIG staff, and AIG was right in the middle of this whole exercise. They were petrified to go out and talk to their independent agents because they were just apologizing all the time. All they did was go out and say, gomen nasai, gomen nasai, gomen nasai. So I said, stop it. You didn't create this problem. right? And I sat with one agent who's pointing his finger at me and telling me about how he'd lost so much money on his AIG stock, et cetera. And I said, well, you know what, go complain to someone else because I lost a lot more money than you did. Now, do you want to do business or not? Right? We're here to grow business, and I'm here to help you, and now let's get on with it, right? They liked that. They respected that. That's why they chose to work with us in the first place. They were working with AIG because it was different, right? And so our job was to deliver on that. They had expectations. I had a lot of people who struggled to live up to that expectation. So that, again, was that middle layer that was sort of sitting there saying, well, the right way to do this in Japan is X.
Is do nothing.
Yeah, and I said, no, it isn't. Guys, that's not going to succeed. Look where it's getting us.
If you want to be successful as a leader, do the Leadership Training for Managers course. All companies need people who can both manage and lead. Leading people screams out for real skills in communication, dealing with all different types of people, being excellent at innovation, planning, delegation, handling mistakes, doing performance reviews really well, and inspiring and motivating the team. Do the Leadership Training for Managers course now in either Japanese or English. So you've got half of the team on board for this, which I think, given the mergers and what you've done, is unbelievable. How do you get engagement in Japan? Now, we talked a little bit beforehand, before we started the interview, that in the organisations I've been in, we have these global either employee satisfaction or engagement surveys, and I have to go to the regional hub, which is often Singapore or Hong Kong, and sit in this room with all the other heads of the countries and the upcoming results, and Europe's off the charts, and South America's great, and India's fantastic, and then you get to the rest of APAC, and it's not so great. And then Japan's at the very bottom, very, very bottom of APAC, the worst in the world, lowest engagement. And then you suddenly get all this pressure about, well, you're doing a terrible job in Japan. The Japanese are not interested. They're not engaged. They're not on board with what we're doing there. You've got to turn this around. I want an action plan on this. Make this change. I'm wondering if you had that same experience.
Well, yeah, that's what we would call a softball. We just actually, sadly enough, late last summer, we did an organizational health survey across the whole group worldwide. Japan finished dead last in satisfaction levels in that process. And, the first thing to tell people is the Japanese have such high expectations around quality and service that they set the bar so high, it's almost impossible to achieve it. You can say that all you want to, and I said that to New York, and they said, yeah, but you still scored the lowest, so what are you going to do about it? What we focus on, interestingly enough, we scored the highest of any territory in the world on motivation. So getting people motivated and interested, we were better than any other market anywhere in the world, which said something about, the progress that we were
making. And isn't that an interesting contradiction? Like your low score on engagement, high score on motivation. How could that work?
Yeah, I think my personal opinion, and I've got a workshop set up with my leadership team to go through the actual detailed results to talk a little bit more about it. I think the reality is that I'm going to come back to my thermal layer again. If there's one area that I feel still incredibly frustrated that I don't feel I've been successful at, and that is to get the communication process to work more effectively.
Why is that?
We've tried. So I have a blog. I have twice a week upwards on my blog. I do a lot of traveling around the country and doing town halls and workshops. I make myself incredibly available through the email systems. I get people email me stuff on a regular basis. We created videos that the organization created to put out there to give people working examples and people they could reach out and touch that they knew from the workplace, et cetera. We created a diversity and inclusion council. We created employee resource groups. A third of my company is a part of employee resource groups, et cetera, all trying to get the message out. And yet, when we did a study of the theme we've pushed for the last 6 years in the biggest subsidiary, the new merged company, last fall, 27% of the staff said they have no idea what it is. Right? And a little bit of it's the frog in the well. Part of it is an organization like insurance. It's an ancient industry, and it acts like it often, very siloed. So people tend to say, I have a job to do, this is what I do. I don't know what goes before me. I don't know what happens after me. It's not my problem. I don't deal with it. So we have to break that down as part of the organizational culture. At the same time, I find that the organization lacks personality. What I mean by that is there's not a culture of the people you work with of understanding who are you, what do you do on the weekends, which is why I was always surprised when everybody would ask me when I'd be out there, what do you do on the weekends? Do you cook? What's your family life like outside of work, et cetera? People aren't generally curious about the people around them. It's about task-driven. There's a lot of managerial capability in Japan, but sometimes the leadership side of things is lacking, right? To me, leadership is about inspiring people to go somewhere that they wouldn't necessarily go on their own. Management is about, I got a set of tasks to do today. Can I get them done with the inputs, with the outputs, and the materials I had to work with? There's a lot of management that goes on here, but not a lot of leadership. And leadership comes because you know who the people are. You're curious about who they are. You respect the differences. You're interested in how they behave. You're interested in what motivates them. You're interested in what doesn't motivate them. And you work that. That's not normal in this environment. What happens is, here's the task. You do yours, you do yours, you do yours. At the end of the day, come back and bring it to me. And we had to get inside of that to say, that's not going to work anymore, right?
And also, I think in Japan, that middle layer, you talk about the thermal layer, that middle layer tends to be, in my mind, like a sponge to get what's going on from above, but to be very parsimonious about what they pass on down the line. So they like to be informed about what's going on, but they don't bother telling everybody else what's going on. So they're absorbing all this, but not passing it on. So how do you get them to understand, hey, listen, your job is to make sure the newest, youngest person joining gets the picture of what we're doing around here and understands the strategy, understands the culture, and it's your job and your responsibility to be the person who amplifies all those things for them and communicates it. So how do we get them to understand that?
Well, first of all, you got to understand, too, that the fact that I'm an American and not a Japanese, that's exacerbated because language also creates complications in that fact, right? So I had to, similarly to what I said before, I had to find examples of situations that could allow me to demonstrate how to break through that. So I'll give you a great example. About 4 years ago or so, we introduced paternity leave. And when we launched it, I said, I want to understand how it's going, keep me briefed. So about 6 months in, the word trickled up to me that there was an individual in one of my companies, the Japanese company we'd bought, that his wife was going to have their first child, and he'd gone in and asked his supervisor if he could take a month's paternity leave, which is what we basically outlined. And the supervisor rejected it. And so it took a couple of weeks for it to work its way up to me, but it got its way up to me, and I sent my chief of staff out and said, go find out what happened here. I don't want the name because I'm likely to go absolutely bananas on this individual, but go find out. Is it because they just were obstinate and they were recalcitrant and wouldn't do it, or was it something else? They didn't understand it, or what happened? So she came back to me about a week and a half later, and she said, well, the good news is it wasn't they were recalcitrant. She said the problem was it's a small team, and the supervisor knew exactly what the policy was, but the individual asking for the paternity leave was the highest performer in the team, in a small team. And for them to be gone in the month that they asked for, which was the peak of the year, he worried he couldn't get his work done. So he said no. So that was one of these eye-opening experiences for me where I realized that supervisor was afraid to ask for help. They figured, I can't go tell somebody I don't know how to solve the problem, or I need some help in order to make this possible. So it was just easier to say no. So basically, that was one of those epiphanies to me that said, we've got to help supervisors understand, I'm going to throw some curveballs at you, and you're not going to be able to handle them all the time. That's okay. That's the nature of the job. When that happens, it's perfectly okay for you to say, hey, I could use some help on this.
Now, if that person had pushed that up to their next reporting level, I wonder, would that person have said, oh, I get the point. Yeah, we'll help you. Let the person take the paternity leave. We'll second someone in, or we'll rearrange your targets, or we'll do something to help you. Or did they make that choice on the basis they knew no help was coming from their next level up?
I'd say it's probably 50% of one, a half dozen of another kind of thing, right? I think there's certainly plenty of their supervisors who were no better off and no better equipped and no more willing to help than they were. In the other cases, there was this general fear that if I ask for help, it's a bad signal on me. If I turn around and say, I don't know how to solve this problem, it's going to somehow reflect poorly on me as a manager, right? So I think you have a combination of those. And so what we've tried to do, and I'm even doing it now in the messaging with the whole coronavirus issue, is to say, hey, I'm throwing curveballs at you. We're dealing with stuff that none of us were necessarily prepared to deal with. I don't expect you to have all the answers. I do expect you, when you don't have one, to ask for help, right? And if you don't ask for help, then you're really on my shit list, pardon my French, right? If you have a situation and you don't know how to deal with it and you don't have the courage to say, hey, I need some help solving this problem, it's important to this organization, it's important to my team, then you're not somebody that should be leading people. And we've actually had to go through that process now. We're in the early stages of fingering those people who've demonstrated they just don't want to be part of this process and tapping them on the shoulder and saying, the door's over there, you need to leave.
Are you doing business with Japan? Do you really know how things work? Japan Business Mastery provides the answers. Do you have the right networks and know how to create them? Do you know how to get on the same wavelength with Japanese buyers? Do you know what being trustworthy looks like from the Japanese perspective? Japan Business Mastery is based on more than 30 years' experience in Japan and will become your go-to guide. Want to succeed in Japan? Buy Japan Business Mastery now. Because that is a big cultural step, isn't it? To say, I'm going to look at this organisation and my accountability differently. I'm going to understand the holistic policy of the company, and I'm going to reach out where I need to reach out, as opposed to just do my little job.
Yeah.
So
it's tricky.
The other part of engagement is getting innovation. So you have R&D people who are doing that as a full-time job, but the sort of innovation I'm talking about is just a general team. We can always do things better. We can come up with faster, smoother, lesser cost, etc. Things that we can actually think about doing. But if people are not engaged in that way, they just keep doing the same old thing. So how do you encourage people to think about, well, where can we make some changes here that are going to be beneficial to the company, and what can you do to bring those changes forward?
Well, I think so. The challenge is to overcome this fear of failure, right? It's also to overcome the basic fundamental cultural environment that the peg that sticks up gets hammered down, right? And so you want to create an environment where it's okay, first and foremost, to say, hey, I've got an idea. You want to create opportunities where that can be done in a non-threatening way. You want to create opportunities where multiple levels of the organization can participate in that process. So a couple of years ago, when we were going to try to revisit how to relaunch one of my brands and businesses here, we went external. We brought in a group externally, and we created almost like a venture capital operation. Took 10 people out of the business, moved them over to the other side of town, set up a new office for 6 months, worked partner in partner with the outside group that was helping facilitate this process. We ran a Shark Tank type of program. So at the end of 5 weeks, they had to put the first 12 ideas on the table. We created a board of both local and foreign executives from the company that we were working with and mine, and we would review these items. We whittled it down. We went through 3 iterations of that. We ended up with 2 ideas that we said, we're betting on these now. We parked a couple of them and said, we like them, but that's not ready yet, or we're not ready yet to go down that path. That was probably the biggest visible thing we've done here that showed to the whole organization. We started out with 12 ideas. None of them were crazy or stupid, but some of them were just not robust enough or thought through enough, or the timing was wrong, or the capital investment was too large. And we said, great idea, park it over here, right? And that we visibly shared with a huge part of the organization. So they saw we were going through this exercise. And it was perfectly okay to say, got a new idea, but guess what? Thank you, but we're not going to run with that one. We are going to run with this. And we continued to shift the people out of the ideas we'd parked and put them into the teams that were focusing on the ideas that were getting traction, right? And so everybody ended up on a winning team. Everybody ended up having gone through a process of putting an idea on the table and not being able to substantiate it enough for it to hold water, but then moving on to the next one. That probably was the single most effective thing we've done here in my stint, to be able to prove to people it's okay to be creative, it's okay to think differently. We even let them change their work hours. So they shifted, just for their own psychological purposes, they shifted their work week from Monday to Friday to Tuesday to Saturday, right? And we were okay with it. They decided they didn't have to wear suits to the office. They could wear sneakers. They could wear jeans, et cetera. I could care less. Come up with the ideas. What I'm looking for is something fresh and different. That opportunity to do that and to showcase that has probably been the most impactful thing we've done in my 10 years, 10 and a half years here this time. Give people a chance to do it.
It's probably too early yet to see the results.
Yeah, well, we just literally last week relaunched that brand. And so we're excited about what it's going to be and where it goes. But it spawned other ideas. So now we're sort of taking that one we put on the shelf and said, I like it, but we're not ready for it yet. Take it down. Now let's bring it back. Let's kick it around a little bit more and see what we can do with it. And we've embraced the ideas that got us to those initial 12 ideas as the way we want to design product and our customer interactions going forward, which are all incredibly different from the way we've done it before.
It's very innovative. So what about trust? Japan is I always think Japan's a very emotional country. When you're sitting in Australia, I grew up looking at Japan, Japanese always seem to be very formal, displayed no emotion, very wooden looking, and I always thought, the Japanese are not very emotional. But when you come here and you live here, you realise, man, they are totally driven by emotion, right?
Right.
And one of those big emotions is based around the degree to which they trust you as their boss, as their colleague, etc. And when you come in as a foreigner, you're not coming out of the same regimented system that they've come through. How do you build trust here with the Japanese team?
I'll tell you that, first of all, I think it's about being human. You got to be real. You got to be accessible. You have to have a degree of humbleness to you. That's important. The second thing, and I actually learned this, my first experience so I came to Japan 6 months and I went to the Philippines. And I learned a very painful lesson in the Philippines where everybody was speaking English. I came in, I was the young Turk. I had 2 vice presidents working for me, a lady and a man. And for the first year, this is what we need to do. We're going to do this, we're going to do this, we're going to do this. Gave them lots of instructions, a lot of direction, et cetera. And at the end of the first year, we sat down, the 3 of us, over lunch one day to talk through, what worked, what did. And I said, I don't feel like we got anywhere near as much accomplished as we could have, et cetera. And they said, yeah, we agree. And they pulled a couple of examples out to me and said, this one didn't really pan out. I said, yeah, why is that? They said, well, did you ever bother to ask us whether we'd tried it before? Did you ever bother to ask us, did we have a different view of the situation? And I realized here I was, because that we spoke the same language, I wasn't even bothering to sort of dig in on this process, and it allowed me to start to think differently. So what succeeded for me there and what I've used subsequent to that, and I think works really well here, is to say, here's what we're trying to accomplish. Okay, let's lay out the goal. Let's discuss the goal. Let's talk about the goal through the lens of each and every stakeholder at the table. Because the finance person may see that goal differently than the product person sees it, than the salesperson sees it, than the fulfillment person sees it, right? And let's shape this so that we all turn around and say, all right, if I put this marker on the table, we can all define what that looks like. Right? We can all say, all right, we can walk out of this room and all say, yeah, everybody, we're all in agreement. Okay. Now, if you agree with that, and we've just gone through the process of doing that, what do you need to do to get it done? If I'm too prescriptive in that process, they'll say, okay, you gave me instructions. I did what you told me to. It's not my job to sit on top of 10,000 people now and in 100 branches across the country and tell them every single person how to do what they do. They have to know that, I've walked a mile in their shoes. I've told them what we're trying to accomplish. I've gone through every different perspective to try to ensure that we're all on the same page. We can all describe it in our own words, but it means the same thing. Now, tell me what you need to do to get that done. What are your problems going to be? What are your challenges? What do we need to do first? What do we need to do second? Is there an obstacle I need to remove for you, et cetera? And they have to own it. It's not, if they're just following my instructions and they don't work, then they just go, well, it didn't work.
It's your fault.
You know, I did what you told me to, it didn't work, right? So you have to create, that's the engagement piece. You got to create a sense of ownership, which means you have to ensure that you're aligned around what it is. What's the objective? What are we trying to achieve? Because if they don't say to you, this is what I'm trying to do and this is how it fits into that picture, then they don't know what they're trying to accomplish. They're just doing work. And the Japanese are really good at doing work, right? It's about making sure that they understand how their piece fits and that they've been given the latitude to figure out how to do it.
So by giving them the freedom to have ownership of the process, do you feel they're generating trust in you as a result?
Absolutely. And I feel the things that are the most telling is when you can have the engagement on an ongoing process and you can get them to say, this isn't working, right? And then you can say, all right, if your answer immediately is, well, you better fix it, right, then you've crossed the line. If you say, all right, well, why do you think it's not working? Is it we don't have enough resource? You think it's the wrong idea? You think the timing's wrong? There's something else that's not ready? What do you need from me? How do I help you? Right? And that process builds that sense. First of all, I can put my hand up and say, it's not going the way I want. Second of all, it's okay to say, gee, I didn't anticipate X, or I thought Y was going to be, closer or easier or cheaper or whatever the case may be. You have to make sure that the dialogue is there. And it's tough when you're sitting on top of a big organization to make that possible, which is why you got to go out and beat the bushes.
Do you go out drinking with staff? The classic, the Japanese model is everyone's very formal in the office, and then you go for drinks, and then everyone's had a few drinks, and you can tell the boss he's a dill, the classic Japanese stereotype. I mean, do you do that?
Yeah,
or,
absolutely.
You do?
Absolutely. It's most fun when you're out in the countryside. My Japanese is okay. I'm not fluent. When I go and I've got to give a speech or something, I have a translator with me. But when we're going out drinking, I don't need the translator. I can handle this. And the Japanese can handle enough of the English, and you can handle enough of the Japanese. And frankly, it's fun, right? And the guard gets dropped. And you have to, in the trust comment, you have to honor that. Because the process here is when you go out and they say things that you don't like and they've had 3, mizuwares, et cetera, you've got to be able to say, okay, I'm not going to hold that against you, right? If you do, then suddenly you've breached that fundamental component. Yeah, which is, and they're smart. They'll send somebody in here in that drinking session who's supposed to drop the dime on you kind of thing, and you got to be aware of that. It's not that person is necessarily something evil or wrong, but everybody's put that person up to it. And so they're going to tell you, this really isn't going to work. You know that, right? And so, you got to flesh that out. You got to make it possible. It's how they're comfortable doing it. You got to let them do it. You got to go with the flow.
And, if I think about, we've talked a lot about your background in leadership. Are there any things that are sort of pertinent to leading in Japan that I haven't asked you or haven't come up yet?
I think my personal experience has been that the human side of you as an individual and a leader really resonates. Some people don't want any part of it. A lot of them do, especially the people who are in the trenches every day, day in and day out. They want to know that the person that they're following is they can touch them. They can reach out and put some context to them. They want to know that they're a human being, that they're not just some order from above. It's not a talking head. It's not a memo. It's not a picture on the top right-hand corner of an email that comes out kind of thing. And I think you can't ever underestimate the importance of that. And that's whether you drink with them or not. But, when I'm out there, it's somebody's birthday. Let's wheel a birthday cake out, sing happy birthday to them, et cetera. I do the karaoke with the guys as well because, and I'm not the last person. I get the mic first, right? Just to show I can do this. I'm not afraid to do this. Let's go type of thing. So I think you have to have the willingness to reach down into the organization. You got to go show them you understand what they're doing. You can sit there at their desk and do it with them. You can ask the questions, etc. They really appreciate that. They'll walk an awful long. You said it a couple of minutes ago. It's a place full of emotion. The basic cultural concept is don't show it, right? But they'll under certain circumstances, and they'll seek them out. They will show it, and they are incredibly emotional, passionate. They want to do the right things. A great sense of humor. They love fun, but they have to put this facade on because that's what culture expects in Japan. So give them the opportunity to break with that and not break the rules. That's tricky, but it makes a big difference.
And if we were thinking about someone who's about to get on a plane or has just arrived and come to Japan, they've been given a leadership role here, they're a complete newbie, they don't know Japan. If we're going to give them a couple of pieces of advice, what would you give them in terms of advice?
I would say, first and foremost, respect the history and the culture that is Japan. It's a proud country with a lot to be proud of. It's a country that has accomplished a tremendous amount in a very short space of time. 150 years ago, it was feudal, right? So respect and appreciate that there's tremendous motivation, there's tremendous sense of community in Japan. If you just go back literally 150 years ago, you had warlords and daimyos that basically had people farming the rice paddies and fishing the oceans and the rivers, etc., and they would protect you and look out for you, right? But that was hard work, and it was hard work. Then planting rice took an awful lot of work, and then you did nothing for a while except keep the water moving, and then you had to harvest the rice, and everybody had to get involved. So respect the history and the culture of Japan. Don't try to turn it. Try to show how you can use that to become competitive and unique and different in the Japanese market. And that's when you can really uncap and uncork potential in Japan.
Any other points?
I would say be resilient. You'll get knocked back a few times. You'll run into the brick wall that's covered in beautiful ivy and not realize it's solid bricks behind it, etc. And focus on the objectives. Don't focus on the individual tasks all the time, because people will then do exactly what you told them to, even if it was wrong. And that's not going to get you anywhere.
Well, thank you very much. This has been another fascinating journey in Japan.
Right.
Well, that concludes this episode of Japan's Top Business Interviews. And my guest, Bob Noddin, has given us the picture from the very, very start as an exchange student right through to becoming the head of AIG in Japan. It's a huge organization, huge responsibility, dynamic business. We're in the throes of, COVID-19 at the moment. So we could have an entire interview just on leading during COVID-19, but we'll leave that for another day. I just want to thank Bob again. Thank you very much.
My pleasure. Thank you.
Okay, well, join us again for the next opportunity to talk about leading in Japan with Japan's top business interviews.